Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us right at the top of the hour for today's PID 101 session that will provide a broad introduction to persistent identifiers. Today's session, as some of you no doubt have probably noticed, builds on other similar series that we have run earlier this year, the second installment of our Open Access 101 series, as well as our Open Education 101 series. And these series in today's PIDS 101 session is meant to provide accessible professional development to folks that are working across libraries and academic institutions. And we hope today's session, as well as past similar sessions, have been helpful for folks and really welcome your feedback on what future topics or types of series would be most helpful in the future. As folks are actively joining the session, I will go ahead and ask folks or invite you to say hi there in the chat if you'd like. We've had particularly active discussions in the chat, I'd say over the past, I don't know, 3 or 6 months or so, and are hoping that that will be the case again and really invite folks to jump in the chat at any point today, whether that's commenting or sharing, relevant experience or resource related to PIDs, or asking a question through the Q&A tab. Also, would encourage you to use the reaction feature on Zoom as well. But again, feel free to introduce yourself briefly in the chat. We are recording the presentation portion of today's session. However, we will turn off the recording as we switch over into Q&A. So, just want to give folks a heads up about that, both the recording at the beginning, but also that we will turn that off to allow folks to sort of speak as candidly as possible in the Q&A portion of today's show. And so, with that, I will start to turn things over to Carly Robinson. And we are incredibly fortunate to have Carly on our team as our senior policy fellow, particularly in this area of persistent identifiers. Carly has deep experience with PIDs, formerly in her position at the Department of Energy. Carly ran multiple national PID consortia for US federal agencies. She has previously served on the board of DataCite and currently serves on the board of ORCID. So with that brief introduction, I will now turn it over to Carly to lead us through this PIDS 101 session today. Carly, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be with you all today and really exciting to get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is persistent identifiers or PIDs. Um, to provide a little bit of framing, you all are very familiar with the work we do at Spark and our focus on enabling knowledge as a human right. And we really work to be a catalyst for action, advancing policies that enable open systems for research and education that enable everyone everywhere to access, contribute to, and benefit from the knowledge that shape our world. And to enable systems that advance knowledge sharing, we have long supported open, non-commercial infrastructure. And that's where PIDs directly connect with Spark's work. Persistent identifiers are key open infrastructure and the connective tissue that make knowledge more discoverable, accessible, citable, and reusable. And of course, PID infrastructure and usage is global. And so, though a lot of our policy work is focused in North America, our work also includes the global context to ensure that our advocacy advances global solutions, and in this case, globally supported and used technical infrastructure. We're focused on supporting persistent identifier infrastructure that creates universal access to research and supports interoperability between the work that we're doing in North America and the rest of the world. So to kind of dive right in, you might ask what we mean when we say and use the term persistent identifier. And there is a range of interpretations and definitions, but generally a persistent identifier is a long-lasting, managed, and registered unique digital reference, often in the form of a URL, to a research object that can be represented or described online. And those research objects can be things throughout the research lifecycle. They can be, people involved, organizations, research outputs, or awards. And the US government has acknowledged that there are tremendous benefits that can be realized in using persistent identifiers. So they've started including PID requirements into different executive directives and have developed a definition that is more on the technical side, and that's to ensure that agencies understand expectations around PID implementation and requirement. And so when I was in the government, I was part of the group that developed this definition. And so in the US government context, which is kind of the definition I'll focus more on today, PIDs must be globally unique, persistent, machine resolvable and processable, and have an associated metadata schema. So as I mentioned, this is more of a technical definition, but to kind of help with what we meant by all of those terms in the definition, we also provided some kind of definitions about those terms or explained what we meant when we said kind of each one of those things in the definition. So when we talk about globally unique, we're talking about the idea that the identifier is universally or globally recognized and attached to a defined resource. So it's not just an internal or organizationally recognized identifier, it's really a global identifier. And so it's not like an internal award number or an internal accession number. Those would not kind of meet that definition. When we talk about persistence, we mean that the identifier needs to be maintained even if the object itself goes away or becomes unavailable. And so you can think of an example of a retracted paper. So a DOI might have been assigned to that article, but even if it's retracted, that DOI still exists and it takes you to a place that gives you some general information, maybe the original title, things like that, and tells you why it was retracted. For machine resolvable, the identifier is typically in the form of a URL that resolves to either the object itself or the landing page that provides more information about the object it's identifying. Machine processable means that the identifier is such that a machine can read the identifier and process information about it. And that information about it would be captured in the associated metadata schema. And so, that schema needs to be defined and associated with the identifier. If the PID is provided from kind of a central service, that metadata schema is typically provided by the persistent identifier provider. So I think you are all very familiar with persistent identifiers and examples, but I figured to kick things off, I would just give one example that is a digital object identifier. This example here is a report that an action plan, and I think that landscape analysis that Spark did and wanted to get a DOI for, so deposited it in Zenodo so that they could get a DOI. And then, of course, Zenodo kind of hosts that landing page that the DOI resolves to. And a DOI is an identifier that meets all of those characteristics within that US government definition. So it's globally unique, and that is helpfully managed through the International DOI Foundation. It's persistent, it's in the form of a URL, so it is resolvable. It has structured metadata associated with it, so it's machine processable. And that metadata schema needs to meet kind of the DOI schema. In this case, I believe it's a data site DOI, so it needs to meet that data site schema. And then Zenodo might also have their kind of own schema on top of it, but both of those will be publicly available. So there are a number of types of persistent identifiers that meet this US government definition. I figured I would start with research outputs because that is, what a lot of folks are familiar with. And this idea of persistent identifiers for research outputs, was kind of an idea of wanting to be able to uniquely identify research outputs, more accurately cite them, and also kind of ask questions about their impact. And so this started with journal articles, but is so much broader now. Persistent identifiers are assigned to data, software, reports, theses, dissertations, all different types of gray literature. And so I just have a few examples here of persistent identifiers that meet that definition. So the first is archival research keys, or ARKs. ARKs often are kind of a bit more of a decentralized persistent identifier, although there is some central infrastructure that can help with that. But they are, assigned to different types of outputs. I've commonly seen them assigned to data, for example. There's also handles. Handles can also be somewhat decentralized, although there is some central infrastructure provided by handles.net. There are DOIs again. DOIs are actually based off of the handle system, but they're very commonly used. And then another I wanted to mention is software heritage, or hash IDs, which are often used to identify software, particularly for preservation purposes. But these are all examples of persistent identifiers that can be used for research outputs. For persistent identifiers for individuals, there is only one that currently meets the definition, the US government definition, and that's ORCID IDs. A person can get an ORCID ID for themselves, and that ORCID ID resolves to basically an online CV where you can have, general information about you, like your work history, your educational history, your research outputs. And that is kind of curated by the person whose record it is, but a kind of authoritative sources can also push information into your ORCID record as long as you give them permission. And this is tremendously helpful because you can reuse the information in your ORCID record in many different systems and workflows. There could be institutional workflows that have ORCID integrations. Funders are, especially in the US government, are starting to require ORCID IDs in certain workflows, publisher workflows, things like that. So it's totally free for a person to get an ORCID ID for themselves and to use it in those various workflows. It's also very helpful for organizations to have persistent identifiers to be able to uniquely identify themselves. So there are some examples where, an organization might change names over time. Some organizations have the same or similar names. So, for example, in the US, the National Science Foundation, of course, we think of the US National Science Foundation, but there are other national science foundations across the world. So knowing which one folks are specifically referring to is important. And then, of course, organizations go by different variations of their name. You can think of any university. University of Michigan, U of M. Sometimes it's, the regions of the university. And so, having a single identifier for that institution is really helpful for those name variations as well. So there has been a lot of work in this space. I first wanted to mention the Open Funder Registry, which was helpful when federal agencies were starting to implement the Holdren memo, because they needed to more accurately track the outputs that they have funded, particularly journal articles. And you can do some of that by searching the acknowledgements, but Crossref and Elsevier partnered to assign DOIs to funding organizations and to give them a persistent identifier. So that was a system that was used for quite a while. That system is transitioning right now, and ROR, Research Organization Registry identifiers, have come up and now are very commonly used to identify organizations that are associated with research, whether they fund research, perform research, publish research. So ROR IDs are becoming very commonly used. Another identifier for organizations I'll mention is the International Standard Name Identifier, or ISNI, which is an identifier that can be used for organizations that contribute to media content. So that can include research, but I would say ROR IDs are much more commonly used for research associated organizations. Persistent identifiers for awards is a newer area. Of course, kind of traditionally, funders have provided grant numbers that can have very important internal meaning and can have some intelligence built in, but those do not kind of meet the requirements to be considered a persistent identifier. And you can't really kind of realize all of the benefits of a persistent identifier, but just having an internal grant number. And so DOIs have emerged as the current option for funders who want to assign a persistent identifier to their award. There's, still some uptake, but it's like I said, it's a newer area, and so it's something that I think a number of funders are exploring at this point, and this is something that there was a lot of discussions in the US government about. In my old office at DOE, we started a program assigning DOIs to awards, particularly for some of the DOE user facilities, so things like the supercomputers, the light sources, the neutron sources. So if you applied to use those facilities and you got an award to use those facilities, you might get a DOI assigned for that. I'll also mention University of California System. They provide grants and awards too, and they're assigning DOIs to their awards. And there are other international and private funders assigning DOIs. I'll just mention a couple: Wellcome Trust, European Union, the Austrian Science Fund. So it is starting to gain more traction, and I think that's because there are just so many benefits to using persistent identifiers, especially for funding. Now, because PIDs are so helpful for identifying and tracking other aspects of the research lifecycle, they have emerged to kind of serve other needs. So I just wanted to mention a couple that you may have run across. The first is research resource identification, or RRID, and these had kind of initially come out to be used to assign to biological materials and tools. They are very commonly used in the biomedical space, but have kind of expanded to be used more broadly than that as well. There are the International Generic Sample Number, or IGSN, which is used to identify physical samples. So it can be things like soil samples or aerosol samples or things like that. So often in kind of the earth and atmospheric sciences, but also broader. And I will say IGSNs were kind of a fully independent identifier for, I think, over a decade, but they have recently decided to transition to use DOIs, I think, in the last couple of years. And so IGSNs have been kind of transitioning to DOIs. And then I also wanted to mention research activity identifiers, or RAIDs. These come out of Australia, who have been using RAIDs and kind of set up the service a number of years ago. And these are used to identify projects. So projects are not always kind of equivalent to grants or awards. Projects can have multiple sources of funding, multiple teams, things like that. And so RAID is a way to kind of capture various other identifiers associated with projects. And there is a pilot in the US, which is very exciting, that I think it's San Diego Supercomputing and Lyrasis are kind of working on that pilot. So there are also some other identifiers, that are really important in the areas that we work in. And some of these, not to take anything away from them, they are very important and tremendously helpful, but they might typically not, they kind of don't meet that US government definition of a persistent identifier. And so I just kind of mentioned a couple of them here. So again, very important, but just don't meet that definition. So we would consider these identifiers, but not persistent identifiers. So persistent identifiers in some cases are provided from kind of a PID provider that provides centralized infrastructure for identifying objects, and they help ensure long-term discoverability, preservation, and accessibility. And they provide these services to the folks that want to kind of utilize persistent identifiers, typically organizations. And so you might be very familiar with all of these, but just to kind of mention, there are some DOI registration agencies, Crossref and DataCite, that organizations are often members of because they want to assign DOIs. Crossref, of course, started with kind of publishers and assigning DOIs to journal articles, but is broader than that. And DataCite started with data, but is also broader than that. So those are kind of the two registration agencies that most folks use. There are some others that are, typically region or country specific. So some in China, some in Japan, things like that. ORCID provides ORCID IDs, and they provide all of the services and infrastructure to support the use of ORCID IDs. ROAR is an initiative that's co-run by California Digital Library, Crossref, and DataCite that all support the ROAR services and infrastructure. And then I mentioned Handle.net already, but they provide some centralized infrastructure for assigning and resolving handle identifiers. So these are kind of providers that provide that centralized infrastructure, but there are also more decentralized persistent identifiers where a group or an organization kind of can set up their own infrastructure, assign identifiers, and have them resolvable as well. So when thinking about which PIDs you might use, it's important to think about your values. And in Spark's case, what we value and support. And so in the work that we do to enable open systems of research, we want to support PID infrastructure that's open, equitable, non-commercial, and allows others to use and build on that infrastructure. It's important to also understand that PIDs do have a cost. So that is not always kind of seen directly by the researchers who are using these persistent identifiers, but it can be felt by organizations like libraries, central IT providers, funders, research organizations that either pay a membership fee to use the PID organization's infrastructure, or would need to pay to kind of set up their own distributed PID infrastructure. And so, not all PIDs are affordable for all use cases. And so that is often kind of a consideration that folks have when thinking about which PIDs they use. So I want to transition a little bit to talk about, why you might care about PIDs and how they can be helpful, especially acknowledging everything else that's going on right now, the challenges that folks are facing. So at the highest level, PIDs can help make work easier, which is really important right now and really great. So PIDs can make information more discoverable, link a lot of things together, and allow it to kind of be more easily reused. For libraries specifically, PIDs can help make information more fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and also can help improve the trust of all of the incredibly important information that you're making available through providing transparent metadata and kind of increased tracking of information workflows. So PIDs are also important to library patrons, to researchers, and PIDs can help researchers find and reuse research materials more efficiently. They also allow for information reuse in various systems that help with burden reduction. So I already kind of mentioned ORCID IDs, for example, can be used to help populate grant applications or funding reporting or various other workflows. They allow researchers to uniquely identify themselves, which can be particularly helpful if you have a common name. And they can also help ensure that they get credit for their work and proper attribution. PIDs are also important and can be for university administration because importantly, they can help accelerate research production through reducing administrative burden, interconnecting information, increasing discovery, reducing duplication of efforts, and providing new collaboration opportunities. PIDs also make it easier to comply and track funder policies, and they help with understanding kind of the downstream impact of research as well. And I've mentioned also important to funders. So talked about the US government seeing the value in PIDs, but lots of other funders do as well. They can help reduce administrative burden when applying for reporting on funding. They can help with disclosure of information that can be used to help determine conflicts of interest, help with information or research transparency, and also help understand kind of the impact of the funding downstream. So the US government has seen kind of so much value in persistent identifiers that they have started to kind of include these requirements, and they've done that in two different memos. So I know you all are very familiar with the 2022 OSTP public access memo, probably mostly section 3, which is focused on publications and data, but also maybe section 4, which focuses on using persistent identifiers to ensure scientific and research integrity. And so there are expectations in the memo about having persistent identifiers assigned to the publication and data outputs, but also for researchers and authors, for research organizations, and for funding awards. You might also be familiar with National Security Presidential Memo number 33 that came out in 2021 at the end of the first Trump administration. There are requirements in that memo for researchers applying for funding to have and use a persistent identifier for themselves in applications, and this can help agencies understand any potential conflicts of interest. So Nick mentioned that I formerly worked at Department of Energy, and I worked to develop all of our PID policies, and I led all of our PID services. So the policies were to kind of implement these memos, and also had the opportunity to work with a lot of other agencies on kind of developing their approaches and policies. And with the last Trump administration support of persistent identifiers, including that in NSPM 33, and of course the benefits that can be realized by using persistent identifiers, we see a lot of advocacy opportunities where we could help drive usage and adoption forward. So beyond the government, there are also, of course, lots of other groups interested in persistent identifiers and developing strategies and standards around them. So there's a Research Data Alliance and RDA group that for some time has been focused on helping countries develop national PID strategies. And there are quite a few of these globally. And those efforts have typically been led by kind of either a central government organization or by the funding organizations within a country. And so there's a lot of great examples across mostly the global north, but there's a lot of examples of national PID strategies that are kind of rolling out requirements and seeing a lot of uptake of PIDs. Of course, the US is always a bit different because of our size and general decentralized approach to things. And so having kind of a single national PID strategy probably doesn't work the same way here that it might in other countries. But there was an effort started to draft a national PID strategy, but that the group working on that kind of wanted broader participation. And so the National Information Standards Organization, NISO, kind of picked that up. They, of course, developed technical standards and best practices. And so they established a working group to evaluate that previous effort and kind of figure out a path forward in the NISO context. So I do serve on that group, and we're in the process of developing a standard that can include characteristics that a PID should meet to be broadly adopted or used. So this is very much still in development, but will be shared broadly for public comment. If I had to guess, I'd say maybe mid sometime next year. So with a fair number of funders and organizations focused on PIDs, I wanted to provide a few examples of kind of PIDs in action today, but also thinking about what is possible for the future. And to think about this, I kind of think about the evolution of scientific of communicating scientific discoveries. And for a very long time, we were in the print world where discovery was limited. You had to, physically go somewhere to read an article, library. And when things moved online, the early internet offered some centralized discovery platforms, which was just so helpful and valuable, especially at the time. And now we're in a place where all research outputs are online, and articles and outputs are really being kind of separated into components with descriptive metadata to aid in discovery. And this is where, I see all of that value with persistent identifiers, connecting components of the research lifecycle, the people and organizations involved, the funding, the awards, supporting that work, the funding organizations, and kind of all of the organizations involved in the process. And PIDs make that all of that information more discoverable, usable, and are, in my opinion, a key part of the evolution of communicating scientific progress. So here's an example that I wanted to provide where PIDs can help kind of make outputs more discoverable. So here is a data repository hosting a data set and has assigned a persistent identifier to it. In this case, it's DOI. But with that persistent identifier, it makes the data set potentially even more indexable into different search platforms, things like Google Dataset Search. It can be indexed there because if this is a DataCite DOI, it would be indexed in DataCite Commons. Also, OpenAlex, of course, is doing incredible work and having kind of persistent identifiers integrated in all of that. And so, a while back, you might have a data set that is kind of in a repository that folks want people to use, but it can be hard to kind of discover where that information lives. And so persistent identifiers can help kind of have that indexed in more places and help make it more discoverable. Wanted to provide an example of where persistent identifiers can help with reducing administrative burden. So let's say this is an NIH-funded researcher who needs to do their annual reporting to receive next year's grant distribution. Of course, in that grant reporting, you can enter kind of all of that information in manually, but that takes a lot of time. So if her ORCID record is up to date with kind of all of her funding sources, research outputs, and more, she can use that to auto-populate aspects of her grant report. And so that saves her a lot of time. So instead of kind of focusing on those administrative tasks, can focus more time and energy on research. Also an example of how PIDs can help kind of understand the impact of work coming out of a specific organization. So in this case, maybe a research administrator is trying to ask questions about research productivity at their institution and potentially wants to look at journal articles authored by their faculty and staff. You can use the institution's identifier to figure out kind of all of the research outputs over time. Maybe it's the total number of journal articles that that institution has published over a number of years. And answering questions like this can be done much more easily using persistent identifiers. So of course you could do kind of a keyword search, which will, get you so far, but if you have persistent identifiers associated with it, it's just much easier to kind of find answers to those questions. Also, here's an example of making a research output more discoverable, which has led to reuse of scientific data and potentially increase the pace of scientific discovery. So this researcher found a data set that's open and has a persistent identifier, which helped make it more discoverable. It was easier to find, and they want to build on that data set. Instead of having to kind of recreate that data, they already start with an advantage and can immediately start building from that. And so, that can help with their research and make it progress more quickly, share their discoveries faster, which hopefully in turn would allow the next person to build on their research if they're making it open. So the examples that I just provided have kind of typically relied on a single type of information having a persistent identifier associated, but thinking more broadly, what if PIDs are used to identify far more aspects of the research lifecycle and are connecting all of this information together? So, if you think of a current typical research lifecycle at a high level, you have an idea, you develop a proposal that's hopefully funded, you kind of move into methodology, collecting, analyzing data, and then sharing that out. And so there are opportunities to use PIDs all throughout that process and that life cycle. So, you can have at the beginning persistent identifiers for the PI and all of the collaborators, have persistent identifiers for the research organizations, for the funding organization, have a persistent identifier for your award. Maybe in your proposal, you had a data management sharing plan that can have a persistent identifier. And once you're starting on the methodology and kind of performing, you can have a project identifier. You might pre-register your study and have an identifier, have a lab notebook. When you're kind of collecting, analyzing the data, you can have instrument, software, model, sample, data, facility identifiers, like kind of all of those can have PIDs. And then on the kind of dissemination side of things, your preprint, journal articles, books, conferences, reports, dissertations, all of those can have persistent identifiers associated with it. You can also have a persistent identifier for the conference itself. If you're doing peer review, the peer review can have a persistent identifier. And then what's great is all of these PIDs interconnect with each other. So here is an example of, a typical research output landing page. In this case, it's a data set. And so you can imagine that this data set has an ARC associated with it, which has a robust metadata schema that collects all of these other persistent identifiers. So within that data set metadata, you can have ORCID IDs for all of the creators or researchers or authors. And for each of those, their affiliations can have a ROR ID. You can capture funding organization information with a ROR ID. You have a DOI for the grant and the award. And then this data set is connected to other outputs. So maybe it references a publication that has a DOI. It could reference a report that has a handle, reference software that has a software hash identifier. And then maybe it's cited by another data set or another publication, which then those persistent identifiers kind of can have all of this detail and connections as well. So now thinking about kind of what's possible in the future if persistent identifiers are widely adopted. So I'm going to use a funder use case here, but say the funder wants to kind of see all of the projects funded over a certain period of time and see all of the outputs emanating from that funding. We'll just use NSF as an example. There are different systems where you can get parts of this information. So for example, you could use USA Spending to find NSF funded projects and grants. You could use NSF PAR to find some of those research outputs. But it can be extremely difficult to connect all of that information to get a kind of a comprehensive view. But if you're using persistent identifiers for all of this information, have a PID for NSF as the funder, have a PID for all of the awards that is used in the acknowledgements, and kind of metadata of the research outputs. These persistent identifiers create those connections and help with sharing, transparency, and information reuse. And then when a funder like NSF wants to ask those kind of questions about the impact of their funding, it becomes a lot easier to get to the answers. And if you also have wide adoption of PIDs, you can create PID graphs, which are just networked information. And that allows you to kind of ask new and different questions and more easily access data to find the answers. So kind of revisiting that institution or university perspective, if you're at a university trying to understand the impact of the research done at your institution, there are many different measures that you could look at. You could look at partnerships and collaborations, total number of researchers contributing to projects or types of outputs being developed. And if all of those things have persistent identifiers associated with it, you can kind of work in these PID graphs or knowledge graphs to more easily explore those metrics and ask new and different questions. So overall PIDs make information, connections, discovery, and tracking a lot easier. And looking to the future with science and scholarship being more fluid, you can imagine kind of moving beyond journal articles being a static record. instead of having to wait for research to be published in more traditional formats. We could explore ways for people to collaborate and build on scholarship in more real time, allowing for advancement more quickly. And persistent identifiers can make those ideas more concrete and attainable. So with that, just want to say thank you so much for your time. I hope this was helpful and hopefully shared a little bit of my love for persistent identifiers. And with that, I will stop and we can jump into questions.